Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? Student sir, are you in any pain? Patient, the fuck kind of dumbest question is that? I just got fucking stabbed. Fuck yeah, I'm in pain. He died within minutes. My pop died of lung cancer. The last lucid thing he did was wake up just long enough to sing "Show Me the Way to Go Home." I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. It was really pretty amazing and freaky at the same time. Fuck cancer. Had a patient on the cardiac ICU during my second month of intern year who had newly diagnosed heart failure that we couldn't figure out what caused it. He was a healthy guy, in his 60s. Did yoga every day. Walked a few miles 5 days a week. Genuinely nice guy, which is always a bad prognostic sign. With his heart failure, his heart was so stretched out and not squeezing adequately to provide the blood and subsequent oxygen he needs to the rest of his body. A few nights into his hospital stay, I come in the next morning and discovered that the senior resident had to code him for sustained unstable heart arrhythmia, unstable VTach. I went and talked with him about it the next morning and he told me that he was in and out of consciousness during it all, from the low blood pressure, but he compared it to the feeling of jumping out of the plane and skydiving. Later that morning I was checking on him again and he didn't look so good. He goes into the arrhythmia again, drops his blood pressure, and is in and out of consciousness. As I'm charging the defibrillator to shock him again, he comes back around, turned briefly and asks me if I'm taking him skydiving again and lets out a nervous laugh before losing consciousness. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy. Spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then, and I didn't show any signs either. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. My mom passed away a couple of hours after I told her I'd be okay and that it's okay for her to go. I've always hoped that I was able to give her the peace of mind she needed to let go. This is a common occurrence. I'm a tech in a hospital. I've seen this before. Patients pick their moment, often. The first I ever saw as a professional was a guy who said he was scared to die alone when he was lucid. He was DNR. Me and my coworkers held his hand for the first 3 hours of my shift, taking turns. His family finally showed up at about 2 a.m. His wife and adopted daughters were there. They went in, and he was dead in 10 minutes. He was waiting for his family to go. He died at 98, with the people he loved, in a warm, comfortable drug bed. We gave him drugs for anxiety and pain, so it was as peaceful as could be. He had a really good death. When I was 13, my grandfather had a heart attack. He hung around for 36 hours. He hung around for the whole family to show up, and then promptly died. Dude was always a fan of having an audience. More recently, I had a guy in his 60s with lung cancer. He was a DNR. His wife said, "Honey, if tonight is the night, that's okay. I understand. I love you and I always will." He gave a thumbs up, smiled, and died 10 minutes later. As a healthcare worker, I firmly believe you helped soothe her at the end. I think of it like falling asleep. You say, "Hey, it's okay. I got it from here," and then they can relax and let it go. Nurse. In hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor. Coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, respond to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. I'm an EMT. Had a patient say I don't feel so good right before they dropped dead of a massive heart attack. It was just the matter of fact way they said it. President FDR's last words seconds before he dropped dead were, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," while he was sitting for a portrait. My great-great-grandfather did the opposite. He was rich enough to have 2 personal physicians during the last few years of his life. 3 minutes before he died, he told one of them that he was feeling remarkably well. So well, in fact, that he decided to sit up in his bed. He didn't make it into a sitting position. I know because I have the obituary. They were very detailed back then. With wide eyes. Don't listen to my family. They want to keep me around forever, but I just want to die. They won't let me. Edit. She wanted to get off dialysis, which was a death sentence for her. Not a medical worker, but I went with my father to say goodbye to my great uncle. His uncle. He was suffering from dementia and clearly on the way out. He no longer recognized people. My father was an only child, and spent most of his time being raised by his uncles, as his father ran a farm all day. Anyway, we're sitting there, and great uncle is snoozing. He suddenly wakes up and clearly sees my father and starts talking to him about a barn and describing it in great detail. Like, he's talking about where it is, the way the paint was flaking off in one corner, and so on. My father is quieter than normal and just saying yes over and over as he describes the barn. Then, just before great uncle loses consciousness, he describes going into the barn and setting it on fire. Turns out that my grandfather and great uncle were having a haluva dispute at one time and burned down the barn to get back at him. Everyone suspected, but never knew for sure. Edit. Looks like I forgot the last words. Most of them were mumbles, but he spoke about how the fire lit up the night and how it took a while to catch. Hospice nurse here had a patient who was experiencing terminal agitation. With an expression of complete terror on his face, he said, "Help me. They are coming to get me." I see the man in the corner again. There was no one, but she'd been seeing a dark man in the corner for days and asking about him. Toward the end, this was all she talked about beside crying for her mother. Cancer. That's the same thing that happened to my dad's father in his last days on earth. He always said he saw someone in the corner. So many comments on this post are talking about seeing someone in the corner of the room, and I'm unsettled. My husband is a PICU nurse, and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights, the little boy would wake up, so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that. He read him a book, then just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep, the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning. His little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband, and he felt terrible about it because, clearly, he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. Edit. Thank you so much everyone for your amazing replies. I have passed along your love and gratitude to my husband. Actually read him some comments and he blushed and got all bashful. Thank you to those who gave this comment silver, golds and platinum. Since my husband did not receive this prices, I went and bought him a PSN card so he can spend on his games and made him his favorite for dinner. Not a medic. My friend's brother committed suicide. He hung himself in his closet while she watched TV in the living room. The last thing he said before going upstairs was, "I'm going to rest." That weirded her out because he never spoke like that. Not my patient but a friend of mine. He had a patent with a AAA. Abdominal aortic aneurysm. Your aorta is bulging and throbbing about ready to pop. The pain is very severe and agonizing, and if it does rupture, the pain immediately goes away and feels so good, but your chances of survival are pretty much non-existent even if you are prepped on the operating table when it ruptures. Anyways, he had a 15-year-old with one, and on the way to the hospital she looks at him and just says, "Oh, that feels so much better," and died about 10 seconds later. I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband, wife, parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away, and he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years. She's my whole life. What do I do without her? It breaks me every time." When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me saying, "Please don't let me die." Not a medical worker, but when I was 14 my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who was always a big goof, was playing along with a joke that he and another classmate were breaking up and said, "This relationship is over," then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect, because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition. Acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back, I was struck by how discolored his face was, and then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely fucked me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment.